The moment had arrived, though no one expected it. A letter arrived at a private wing of the palace. Not just any letter. A letter that would upend decades of protocol, privilege, and personal loyalty. The kind of letter that could make the strongest family bonds tremble. Harry and Meghan read it in stunned silence. Their faces, usually composed for cameras, betrayed something far more human: shock, disbelief, and yes, tears. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex, once the golden couple of modern royalty, had just been officially severed from the lifeblood of the monarchy. Every title, every funding stream, every patronage they had held dear was now officially revoked. This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a leak. It was official, and it came from none other than Prince William himself. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Can you imagine receiving news like that? That everything you've been building, every effort to connect with both the public and the crown, has been cut off in one stroke. You might think that family always comes first, but in the world of the British monarchy, duty and tradition sometimes overshadow blood. And this decision, this seismic royal order, was about far more than paperwork. It was about power, reputation, legacy. Harry and Meghan had walked a delicate line for years, balancing royal expectations with their own personal ambitions. They had dared to carve out a life that seemed to challenge centuries of royal tradition. Public appearances, high-profile interviews, Netflix deals, media ventures, they did it all. And while the world watched in awe and criticism alike, whispers echoed through the halls of Buckingham Palace. Whispers of disapproval, whispered doubts about loyalty, and questions about the future of the monarchy. No one ever expected these whispers to culminate in such an irrevocable action. The letter itself was concise, almost clinical in its wording. But behind every carefully chosen word was a decision that had been agonized over for weeks. Advisors consulted, meetings held in secret chambers, discussions between William, senior aides, and even King Charles himself. Every angle, every implication, every potential fallout had been considered. And then, finally, the ink dried. The papers were signed. The final cut had been made. What could have driven William to make such a drastic move? Was it personal betrayal? Was it the constant media circus that seemed to follow his younger brother and sister-in-law wherever they went? Or was it a calculated, strategic decision to protect the monarchy from further scrutiny and scandal? Perhaps it was all of these. But one thing was certain. The moment the letter reached Harry and Meghan, their world shifted. For years, the public had watched a royal drama unfold in stages. First, it was small disagreements, minor protocol disputes, and whispered tensions. Then came the more publicized clashes, explosive interviews, tell-all statements, and highly scrutinized appearances that seemed to blur the line between private grievance and public spectacle. And now, with this single act, the private struggle had become undeniable. The final act, some might say, of a saga that had been years in the making. Imagine standing in their shoes. You've spent your life being adored, criticized, celebrated, and scrutinized in equal measure. You have a platform that few could even dream of, yet it comes with chains invisible to the casual observer. And suddenly, those chains are snapped, not in freedom, but in isolation. Stripped of everything that symbolized your connection to centuries of history. That is the magnitude of this moment. The palace, ever the picture of stoicism and tradition, was not immune to emotional upheaval. Senior aides exchanged tense glances. The household staff whispered quietly in corners, and somewhere in the corridors of power, senior royals weighed the implications. Every move would now ripple outward, from the media headlines to social circles, from charitable foundations to the global perception of the monarchy. The world was watching, and the stakes had never been higher. What makes this moment even more remarkable is the sheer finality of it. Harry and Meghan were not being asked to step back gradually or negotiate compromises. This was a clean, unequivocal break. No honorary titles, no funding, no royal patronages. Nothing. The decision marked a boundary that could not be crossed, a line drawn in history that would forever distinguish the roles of those inside the monarchy from those outside it. And yet, amidst the shock and heartbreak, there is an undeniable human story. Here are two individuals, navigating not just public scrutiny, but personal disappointment, facing the consequences of choices that reverberate far beyond their immediate circle. It is easy to get lost in the headlines and forget the human element, the tears, the uncertainty, the quiet moments of reflection that no one will ever see. This is not just a story about titles or privileges. It is a story about family, loyalty, and the weight of legacy. How do you reconcile love with duty? How do you move forward when the very institution that defines you turns away? These questions do not have easy answers, and that is what makes this story both captivating and tragic. The world will now watch closely. Headlines will scream, social media will explode, and public opinion will be divided as never before. Some will condemn, others will empathize, but all will be compelled to pay attention. Because when royal lives are shaken at this level, the ripple effects touch far more than the palace walls. They reach every corner of society, every conversation, every debate about tradition, power, and family. And yet, the most shocking revelations may not even be in the letter itself. What came next? The private conversations, the secret meetings, the phone calls that followed, would set the stage for events that no one, not even the most seasoned royal watchers, could have predicted. The story had only just begun, and the first chapter had ended with a tear-streaked face and a reality that was impossible to ignore. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace seemed almost serene that morning. The sun streamed through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace, gilding the walls with golden light. Staff moved quietly through the corridors, the faint clatter of polished shoes against marble floors echoing softly. To the outside world, everything appeared perfect. Royal duties were being attended to, gardens maintained, schedules followed. A picture of calm, a portrait of tradition. But appearances, as always, can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, the tension was palpable. Whispers floated through hallways like unseen currents. A carefully delivered word here, a subtle glance there. Palace aides exchanged quiet, knowing looks, aware that something monumental was unfolding just out of sight. The air was thick with anticipation and unease. Everyone sensed it, though no one could yet articulate it. And in the private wings, Harry and Meghan carried on their routines, seemingly unaware of the storm gathering around them. But even they felt it, the quiet, creeping tension that comes from knowing that powerful forces are at work, forces beyond personal control. How many times had they navigated the treacherous waters of royal expectation, only to find that no matter how carefully they moved, they were always one misstep away from catastrophe. Imagine waking up in that gilded cage, surrounded by the privileges of royalty, yet feeling a shadow looming over your every action. Every public appearance, every interview, every charitable engagement was scrutinized not just by the press, but by those closest to you. And as the hours passed that morning, the sense of inevitability grew. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. What was it that had the palace in such suspense? Perhaps it was the culmination of months of private discussions, debates, and deliberations among the senior royals. Perhaps it was a single decision, already made but not yet delivered, poised to ripple through every layer of the monarchy. And perhaps, deep down, even Harry and Meghan knew that a line had been drawn, invisible but unmistakable, separating them from the world they once inhabited. In the midst of this quiet tension, small details took on enormous significance. A missed call, a hastily canceled engagement, a whispered conversation that stopped abruptly when a senior aide entered the room. Every gesture, every word, every glance was loaded with meaning. For those watching closely, it was clear that the calm was a veneer, a fragile mask over a brewing storm. William, meanwhile, moved through the day with a quiet determination. His face was composed, his expression inscrutable, but his mind was alive with strategy and calculation. He had reached a point where action was unavoidable. For years, he had weighed the consequences, measured loyalty against duty, and considered the implications of every choice. And now, the decision was before him, irreversible, monumental, and, to some, ruthless. What drove a man to make such a choice? Was it anger? Disappointment? A profound sense of responsibility to the crown and to history? Or was it a calculated act of preservation, an attempt to safeguard the monarchy from continued scrutiny and potential scandal? Likely it was all of these. Yet the personal toll was undeniable. Even the most composed among royals are not immune to the sting of family discord. And as William prepared to sign the final order, the weight of that reality pressed heavily upon him. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, Harry and Meghan moved through their day with a mix of anticipation and unease. They had sensed that something significant was imminent, though they could not predict the scale or nature of the impending decision. Every knock on the door, every ring of a phone, every message delivered by a trusted aide carried with it the potential to change everything. The tension was unbearable, yet strangely hypnotic. The calm before the storm is always the hardest to endure because it leaves the imagination to wander into the darkest corners. How did they spend their time, knowing that the world they had built might be slipping away? Did they cling to routines, hoping normalcy would protect them? Did they attempt to reach out to William or other family members, seeking reassurance or compromise? Or did they sense that their fates had already been sealed, that no words, no actions, could reverse what was about to happen? It is in these moments, before the storm breaks, that true character is revealed. How do you respond when everything familiar begins to crumble around you? Do you panic, lash out, or retreat into quiet reflection? Harry and Meghan, like any human beings, experienced a spectrum of emotions: anxiety, dread, defiance, even a glimmer of hope that somehow, someway, reason and family loyalty would prevail. Outside the palace, life carried on, oblivious to the tension within. Tourists strolled through the gardens, photographers captured the iconic facade in the golden morning light, and the city of London continued its rhythm, unaware that history was about to shift dramatically. The contrast between the serene exterior and the charged interior could not have been more stark. The monarchy, often perceived as a bastion of stability, was on the brink of one of its most dramatic internal upheavals. And then there were the subtle signals that everyone in the palace, even the most inexperienced aides, could read like a map of tension. The clink of a pen on a polished desk, the rustle of papers that carried orders yet to be delivered, the slight hesitation of a footstep outside a private room. Each movement, each sound, amplified by the charged atmosphere, was a harbinger of the seismic change to come. By midday, the tension had reached a nearly unbearable crescendo. Conversations became shorter, glances more pointed, and every interaction seemed laden with unspoken meaning. The palace was alive with anticipation, a place where history was about to be written in the quietest, most decisive way imaginable. And then, just as the day seemed to stretch endlessly, the letter arrived. Delivered with the precision and discretion expected of palace staff, it was a simple, elegant envelope. Nothing about its appearance betrayed the magnitude of its contents. Yet the moment it landed on the table, the atmosphere shifted. The calm was broken. The storm had arrived. What would the letter say? How would it change the trajectory of two lives forever intertwined with the monarchy? Every heart in that room seemed to stop, caught in a moment of collective suspense. The very walls seemed to hold their breath, knowing that the events about to unfold would echo for generations. And in that pause, that fleeting instant before history was made, everyone understood. The calm was over. The storm was here, and nothing would ever be the same again. But what happened when Harry and Meghan finally opened that letter and read the words that would redefine their lives, would shock even the most seasoned royal observers. What had brought the palace to this point? What series of choices, actions, and public moments had pushed Prince William to the edge, compelling him to take the most drastic action in decades of royal history? To understand the gravity of the decision, we need to look at the moves Harry and Meghan had made in recent months. Their public appearances, statements, and behind-the-scenes maneuvers that, for some, bordered on rebellion. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. The couple had returned from a high-profile international tour, greeted by crowds and media attention that most would envy. Smiling, poised, perfectly photographed, everything a royal appearance demanded on the surface. But underneath that polish, a careful, deliberate narrative was taking shape. Harry and Meghan were crafting a new identity, independent, influential, and increasingly detached from the traditional structures that had defined their lives. Think about it. For decades, the monarchy had followed a strict script, appearances planned months in advance, interviews cleared through communications offices, charitable engagements carefully aligned with the crown's public image. Any deviation was noticed, analyzed, and, sometimes, condemned. Yet Harry and Meghan began to bend these rules, not recklessly, but strategically. A casual remark in an interview here. A social media post celebrating independence there. Small shifts that, taken together, painted a picture of a couple stepping away from the royal playbook entirely. One of the first sparks came during a televised discussion on modern philanthropy. Harry, typically reserved in public forums, spoke candidly about the importance of independent action, emphasizing that real change sometimes required stepping outside established institutions. Meghan, ever articulate, amplified the sentiment with her own reflections on influence, leadership, and global responsibility. The lines were carefully chosen, but to palace insiders, they were unmistakable. The couple was signaling a new direction, one that placed personal agency above royal protocol. The media noticed immediately. Headlines splashed across screens worldwide. Harry and Meghan chart their own course. The Sussexes speak out. Royal boundaries tested again. Public opinion fractured. Supporters praised their courage, calling them forward-thinking and authentically themselves. Critics, however, accused them of undermining centuries of tradition, of placing ego above duty. And within the palace walls, every headline, every soundbite, was scrutinized like a chess move on an enormous board where each piece represented centuries of history and authority. But the real tension wasn't just public appearances, it was the couple's behind-the-scenes strategy. Private communications with influential media figures, Hollywood insiders, and global charitable organizations created networks of influence that existed outside the traditional royal oversight. It was subtle, sophisticated, and to some, alarming. The couple had always been media-savvy, but the scale and precision of these moves suggested a deliberate effort to operate independently, perhaps even in defiance of established expectations. Consider the timing. These actions coincided with discussions about the future of royal funding and titles, which were quietly being debated among senior aides and advisors. Each public statement, each appearance outside the royal-approved calendar, created a ripple effect. Every accolade or endorsement they received outside the palace walls served as both a personal triumph and, inadvertently, a challenge to the monarchy itself. It wasn't malicious, at least not overtly, but it was undeniable in its impact. And there were other, more personal moves that inflamed tensions. A late-night call to a high-profile journalist, a strategically timed appearance at a philanthropic gala, even seemingly innocuous social media posts, which, when analyzed collectively, painted a narrative at odds with the message of unity the palace sought to convey. Every move was like a small stone thrown into still water, each creating waves that disrupted the calm surface of royal life. The emotional impact on William cannot be overstated. For years, he had tried to bridge the gap between tradition and modernity, between duty and personal relationships. He had mediated, counseled, and, at times, quietly tolerated deviations in hopes that family bonds would endure. But the pace and audacity of Harry and Meghan's recent moves signaled a new reality. It was no longer just a matter of image or perception. It was a matter of influence, authority, and the long-term integrity of the institution itself. One particularly sensitive episode occurred during a private family meeting convened in early spring. Details remain murky, but insiders confirmed that a heated discussion erupted over a media engagement Harry and Meghan had undertaken without prior clearance. The meeting, intended as a conversation about mutual understanding, devolved into an emotional confrontation. Words were exchanged that would later be cited as part of the rationale for the drastic measures William would take. The sense of betrayal, the feeling that trust had been broken, lingered long after the meeting adjourned. And yet, there were contradictions that made the situation even more complex. Harry and Meghan were not reckless. They were strategic. They believed in their approach, convinced that they could balance independence with loyalty, influence with respect. They were not trying to hurt their family. They were trying to define their own roles in a world that demanded both authenticity and visibility. But in a system as rigid and tradition-bound as the British monarchy, perception is reality. Even well-intentioned actions can be interpreted as defiance, as betrayal, as a threat. Emotional spikes were inevitable. Palace aides reported long nights filled with tense discussions, whispered phone calls, and anxious pacing. Even those not directly involved could feel the gravity of the situation. The emotional resonance of these moves extended far beyond Harry and Meghan themselves, touching senior royals, staff, and advisors. Everyone sensed that a decision of unprecedented magnitude was imminent. At the same time, Harry and Meghan continued their work, seemingly undeterred. Charitable initiatives, speaking engagements, and media projects progressed with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. The juxtaposition of their calm professionalism and the turmoil they were creating or navigating highlighted the complexity of their position. Were they unaware of the full implications? Or were they fully cognizant, pushing boundaries deliberately, knowing that history was watching? And then there was the global perspective. International media outlets dissected every word, every gesture. The couple's every move was analyzed through multiple lenses: social, political, cultural. Public sentiment swung like a pendulum, sometimes in favor, sometimes against. And within this maelstrom, the palace had to act, not merely to protect image, but to safeguard the institution itself. Direct questions to the audience become unavoidable here. Could you maintain composure under such scrutiny? Could you act rationally when your every word is being dissected, your motives questioned, your loyalty doubted? Harry and Meghan faced this challenge daily, and now, every decision they had made was coming to a head. By the time the pivotal moments arrived, the meetings, the signed papers, the delivery of the final letter, the cumulative effect of all their recent moves had set the stage. What had been subtle shifts and minor provocations had become a narrative of defiance, a tableau in which the monarchy felt compelled to respond decisively. And as the world watched, unaware of the precise machinations behind closed doors, Harry and Meghan prepared to confront the consequences of the path they had chosen. Every action, every calculated step toward independence, had led inexorably to this moment. Their recent moves, careful, deliberate, and sometimes controversial, had forced the hand of the future head of the monarchy. And yet, even as the letter arrived, even as the official decision was handed down, one cannot help but wonder, did Harry and Meghan truly understand the full weight of their choices? Could they have predicted that the culmination of their independence would trigger tears, shock, and the severing of every royal tie? Or were they, as ever, committed to forging their own path, regardless of the personal cost? But what happened the moment they opened the letter, the words that would change everything, would reveal a reality far more severe than even the most sensational headlines could capture. How does a man decide to sever the very ties that bind his own brother to centuries of tradition? How does a prince, heir to one of the most storied monarchies in the world, weigh loyalty against duty, love against legacy, and friendship against the institution he is sworn to protect? These are questions few could ever answer. Yet Prince William faced them in the quiet halls of Buckingham Palace, alone with his thoughts and the weight of history pressing upon him. The decision was not made in haste. In fact, it was the product of months, years, perhaps, of careful observation, counsel, and reflection. William had watched his younger brother, Harry, navigate the treacherous waters of public life with Meghan Markle by his side. He had seen the subtle rebellions, the media statements, the carefully choreographed appearances that signaled independence. And with each move, a quiet alarm had grown inside William, a sense that the delicate balance of the monarchy was being tested in ways that could not be ignored. Behind the polished exterior of royal life, private meetings had taken place. Advisors whispered in corridors. Legal experts reviewed statutes and precedents. Every potential consequence, public outrage, media frenzy, family discord, was weighed with meticulous care. William understood that this was more than just a family quarrel. This was a matter of institutional survival. The monarchy, like any organization, depended on coherence, continuity, and control. Once lines are crossed, once precedent is broken, the ripple effects can last decades. It's worth pausing to consider the emotional context. William was not acting out of cold ambition. He was acting out of a deep sense of responsibility to the crown, to the people, and to history itself. Yet that responsibility came at an emotional cost. Cutting off your own brother is not something done lightly. even in the most rational of circumstances. Every choice was measured against the potential for hurt, regret, and the inevitable tension that would echo through every family gathering, every holiday, every private conversation for years to come. One of the most challenging aspects of the decision was the human element. William knew Harry's character intimately, the courage, the compassion, the impulsiveness. He knew Meghan's determination, intelligence, and influence, and he understood the bond between them. Yet he also recognized that sentiment could not dictate action when the future of the monarchy hung in the balance. This is the paradox of royal duty. Love does not always align with responsibility, and sometimes tough decisions must be made regardless of the personal pain they inflict. The process of making the decision involved multiple layers. First, there were the private consultations with senior aides. Every detail, every precedent, every potential fallout was considered. Legal opinions were gathered, historical examples reviewed, and contingency plans developed. This was not simply a matter of emotion. It was a calculated, strategic move, one designed to protect both the crown and the integrity of the institution. Next came internal family deliberations. Though discussions were limited to the highest echelons, they were intense. The king, senior royals, and William himself engaged in long, sometimes tense dialogues about the proper course of action. Each conversation was steeped in nuance. The need for fairness versus the need for firmness, compassion versus decisiveness, loyalty versus duty. The stakes could not have been higher, and every word carried weight. William also had to consider the broader implications. The monarchy is not a private family. It is a public institution, scrutinized by millions around the world. Every move is analyzed through countless lenses: media, political, cultural, and social. In taking this action, William knew that the decision would ripple far beyond palace walls. Public perception, international opinion, and the narrative of the monarchy itself were all factors in the calculus. But it wasn't purely about strategy. There were deeply human considerations as well. William thought about the pain of confrontation, the heartbreak of family discord, and the very real risk of creating a permanent rift. He understood that history would judge him not only for the decisiveness of his action, but also for the compassion, or lack thereof, he displayed in executing it. He also considered Harry's past actions, the comments, the decisions, the public appearances that, while perhaps innocent or well-intentioned, had undermined the cohesion of the family and institution. Every minor incident, when viewed collectively, painted a picture of a couple increasingly independent of the monarchy's framework. To William, these were not isolated moments. They were patterns, trends, signals that something had shifted irreversibly. There were practical matters as well. Funding, titles, and patronages all carried legal and procedural weight. Revoking them was not a symbolic act alone. It was a formal process that required precision, foresight, and careful execution. Advisors meticulously reviewed every clause, every historical precedent, and every potential loophole. The goal was to ensure that the decision could withstand scrutiny, both legal and public, while minimizing risk to the monarchy itself. Throughout this process, William faced his own internal conflict. He loved his brother. He understood his motivations. Yet he could not allow personal feelings to cloud his judgment. Royal duty, after all, is not a matter of personal preference. It is an obligation to history, to tradition, and to the millions who place trust in the crown. To fail in this duty could imperil more than just family dynamics. It could undermine the very stability of the institution. One particularly intense moment came during a private late-night session, where William reviewed the final draft of the decision documents. He read and reread every line, weighing tone, clarity, and potential interpretation. Would the words convey firmness without cruelty? Authority without arrogance? Each sentence was scrutinized for both meaning and emotional resonance. Even in the act of detachment, he felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. And then came the psychological toll, knowing that the action would bring tears, heartbreak, and perhaps lasting resentment weighed heavily on him. How does one reconcile the necessity of a decision with the emotional cost? How do you prepare for the faces of loved ones when you deliver news that will upend their world? These questions haunted the quiet hours, yet the decision could not be delayed. In parallel, the palace was preparing for the delivery of the news. Staff were briefed, protocols established, and contingencies planned. Every detail had to be accounted for, from the wording of the letter to the timing of its delivery. There was no room for error. And yet, amid this meticulous preparation, there was an undeniable human drama unfolding. Two people about to confront a reality that would leave them in tears, a family about to experience a fracture that might never fully heal. By the time the final decision was ready, William had gone through every conceivable scenario. He had considered compromise, mediation, delay, and dialogue. But ultimately, he concluded that decisive action was necessary. The monarchy could not afford ambiguity. The message had to be clear. Independence was acceptable, but the privileges and responsibilities tied to the royal institution were not negotiable. The final moments before signing the documents were quiet, almost ceremonial. A pen hovered over paper. A deep breath was taken. And then, with a single, deliberate stroke, history was set in motion. What had been a series of private frustrations and cautious observations became an irrevocable act. The die was cast. The consequences, immediate and far-reaching, would unfold in hours, days, and years to come. And yet, even as the decision was made, William must have known that this was only the beginning. The delivery of the news, the reaction of Harry and Meghan, the subsequent media storm, all of it lay ahead. The act itself was only the first chapter in a drama that would dominate headlines and palace corridors alike. But what happened the moment Harry and Meghan received the official notice, the very words that defined the final cut, would spark emotions, reactions, and consequences that no one could have fully anticipated. The palace had been alive with tension all morning, but no one could have prepared for the moment the announcement would finally land. It was a quiet wing, far from the ceremonial halls and the glittering public spaces of Buckingham Palace. Yet the air felt heavy, electric with anticipation. A single envelope, carried with utmost discretion by a senior aide, would change the course of two lives forever. Imagine holding a document that contains the power to redefine your identity, your future, and your very place in history. Harry and Meghan, accustomed to both public adoration and media scrutiny, felt the weight of that envelope in their hands like a physical manifestation of every choice, every step, every deviation from tradition that had brought them here. Every move they had made, every boundary they had tested, suddenly converged into a single, undeniable reality. The envelope itself was elegant, understated, a hallmark of royal discretion. No ornate seals, no dramatic flourish. Just a simple, unassuming piece of stationery that carried a world-altering verdict. There was no warning, no preamble, no mitigating language. The message it contained was final, unequivocal, and irrevocable. Every title, every funding source, every royal patronage was revoked. In essence, Harry and Meghan had been stripped of the privileges that had defined their royal lives. The moment they opened it, the initial reaction was disbelief. How could this be happening? Was this a misunderstanding? A mistake? The couple stared at the document as if the words themselves were impossible to comprehend. But there was no misreading the facts. The order had been signed. The decision was real. And in that quiet room, far from cameras or public commentary, the human element was undeniable. They were left in tears. It was a mixture of shock, grief, and perhaps a dawning sense of inevitability. Every emotion that had been building in private meetings, media appearances, and whispered conversations now came crashing down in a single, overwhelming wave. Tears rolled silently, the kind that cannot be quelled by composure or media training. This was not performance. This was raw, unfiltered human reaction. And yet, even in that private heartbreak, there was a tangle of contradictions. There was sorrow for the loss, yes, but also a spark of defiance. A sense that, despite this dramatic severing, their identity, their influence, and their voice could not be entirely erased. How do you process both devastation and resolve in the same breath? It is a question few can answer, and one that only adds to the drama of the moment. The announcement, of course, could not remain private for long. Though the palace had attempted to manage the release carefully, the ripples spread quickly. Staff whispered, advisors speculated, and every aide and assistant understood the gravity of the moment. News of the official revocation of titles, funding, and patronages was bound to leak. In a world where information travels faster than tradition, the story would not stay contained within palace walls. Yet, for Harry and Meghan, the immediate concern was intensely personal. Every relationship within the royal family would now be reframed. Every engagement, every conversation, every family gathering carried a new weight, a subtle but unmistakable shift in dynamics. How do you interact with your own family when a formal line has been drawn? How do you navigate both love and institutional alienation simultaneously? These were not theoretical questions. They were reality, delivered in a single, elegant document. William's role in the announcement added another layer of complexity. It was not a public condemnation, nor was it delivered in anger or drama. It was calculated, precise, and entirely deliberate. Every word had been considered, every nuance weighed. This was William as the custodian of tradition, as the protector of the monarchy, making a decision that history would remember. And yet, the personal dimension was unavoidable. He had not simply acted against strangers. He had acted against his own brother, against people he had grown up with, shared childhoods with, and loved. The emotional complexity of this decision cannot be overstated. To outsiders, it might appear as a simple administrative action. Titles revoked, funding withdrawn, patronages reassigned. But for those involved, the consequences were profound. Relationships were altered, trust was tested, and a chapter of family history had been rewritten in stark, irreversible terms. The human cost, though invisible to the public eye, was immense. As the couple absorbed the contents of the announcement, questions must have flooded their minds. Was there any recourse? Any possibility of reversal? Could they appeal, negotiate, or mitigate the consequences? Or was this truly the final, irrevocable act of separation from the institution that had defined so much of their lives? Every scenario, every potential outcome, now carried the weight of emotional gravity. The wider royal family, meanwhile, was also bracing for impact. Charles, Kate, Anne, and other senior figures understood the necessity of the announcement, but that did not diminish the human tension it created. Conversations that might have been casual were now charged with unspoken significance. Every glance, every word, every interaction carried the shadow of the decision. The palace, often a symbol of stability and continuity, was now a stage for one of the most dramatic moments in recent history. Outside the palace walls, speculation began almost immediately. Media outlets, social platforms, and public forums erupted with analysis, conjecture, and judgment. Some praised William's decisiveness, framing the move as necessary to preserve the monarchy's integrity. Others criticized the action as harsh, unforgiving, and emotionally cold. Across the world, audiences debated the balance between family loyalty and institutional duty, wondering what could possibly have led to such a monumental decision. And yet, even amid this frenzy, one detail remained central. Harry and Meghan were human beings, experiencing real, raw emotion. It is easy to reduce royal actions to headlines, press releases, or talking points. It is easy to forget that these are people navigating grief, shock, and betrayal in real time. And in that private moment, far from public commentary, the weight of the announcement settled on them like a physical force. There were questions that could not be answered immediately. How would this affect their public engagements? Their charitable work? Their plans for media projects and advocacy initiatives? How would their personal relationships within the family evolve? Every decision made in the next hours and days would be influenced by the emotional and practical consequences of the announcement. And there was, of course, the undeniable drama of timing. The announcement did not happen in isolation. It coincided with ongoing media projects, scheduled public appearances, and delicate international engagements. The intersection of personal heartbreak and public scrutiny created a tension almost impossible to manage, a pressure cooker environment in which every choice mattered exponentially more than usual. Directly asking the audience, how would you react if everything you had known and worked for was suddenly taken away? Could you maintain composure in the face of both personal grief and global attention? Harry and Meghan, for all their experience in the public eye, were confronting a scenario that transcended typical media scrutiny. This was personal, private, and devastating, all at once. The climax of the announcement came not with fanfare, but with a quiet, undeniable truth. the finality of William's decision. There were no negotiations, no possibilities for compromise, no shades of gray. Titles revoked, funding withdrawn, patronages reassigned. The official act was completed, leaving Harry and Meghan to process the reality in their own time and space. And yet, even as the dust settled, the next chapter of the drama was already emerging. The public reaction, the family fallout, and the couple's next moves would all unfold in ways that no one could fully predict. Every eye was on them, every conversation scrutinized, every action interpreted. The announcement was just the beginning of a story that would dominate headlines, palace discussions, and social discourse for months to come. But what Harry and Meghan did immediately after reading the announcement, and the private conversations that followed, would set off a chain of events that even the most seasoned royal observers could not have anticipated. The announcement had barely settled when the ripple effects began to spread throughout the palace. Royal life, always governed by protocol, tradition, and the quiet pulse of hierarchical order, was suddenly in upheaval. Conversations that would normally have been mundane, the planning of garden events, the coordination of schedules, the minor adjustments of ceremonial duties, were now charged with tension. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged, carried the weight of the seismic decision that had just been made. Charles, the king, understood the gravity immediately. Though he had long been aware of the tensions between his sons, the public announcement made the situation irreversible. The corridors that were usually filled with measured calm now echoed with murmurs, whispers, and the subtle sounds of hurried footsteps. Advisors huddled in corners, strategizing about how to handle potential fallout. Staff, many of whom had dedicated their lives to service, felt the emotional weight, knowing that the story about to unfold would dominate international headlines. William, while resolute, could not escape the human consequences of his actions. For years, he had mediated disputes, offered counsel, and attempted to maintain a delicate equilibrium between loyalty to his family and duty to the institution. Now, the balance had shifted irreversibly. Every interaction within the family would be touched by this decision. The Christmas table, long a symbol of unity, was suddenly fraught with unspoken tension. Family holidays, private conversations, and even informal moments of connection carried the shadow of recent events. Kate, often the silent stabilizing force in the family, found herself navigating a particularly difficult position. She understood the necessity of William's decision from an institutional perspective, yet her empathy for Harry and Meghan as a brother and sister-in-law was undeniable. She moved carefully, offering support where appropriate, trying to bridge gaps that seemed wider than ever. Every smile, every gesture, every word was laden with layers of meaning, signaling both solidarity and acknowledgement of the human cost. Princess and other senior royals had their own responses. Known for her forthrightness and keen understanding of duty, and viewed the situation with both pragmatism and concern. She was aware that the public would scrutinize not only the immediate decision, but the family's subsequent behavior. Every appearance, every charitable engagement, every public statement would be analyzed for indications of cohesion, fracture, or discord. In private, and offered advice, counsel, and historical perspective, reminding family members that precedence and perception would shape the legacy of this moment. Yet despite these measures, the human element could not be contained. Emotional responses, ranging from anger to heartbreak, simmered beneath the surface. Staff members, accustomed to discretion and decorum, felt the strain as they navigated the competing demands of personal loyalty, professional duty, and the expectations of the global media. Even in a household defined by centuries of tradition, the fallout created unpredictable emotional terrain. Harry and Meghan themselves were still reeling. The private anguish of being stripped of titles, privileges, and institutional support was compounded by the knowledge that family relationships were now irrevocably altered. Every memory, every shared experience, now carried a new resonance. The dinners, gatherings, and private moments that had once been simple expressions of familial love were now imbued with tension, mistrust, and sadness. Insiders confirmed that the immediate aftermath included long, private conversations among senior family members. Questions were asked, explanations sought, and, in some cases, apologies offered. Yet the fundamental truth remained. William's decision was final. The monarchy, for better or worse, had drawn a line in the sand. And in doing so, it forced every member of the family to confront the delicate balance between personal loyalty and institutional duty. The fallout was not limited to emotional reactions. Practical considerations immediately arose. Patronages held by Harry and Meghan had to be reassigned. Charitable organizations awaited clarification, anxious about continuity and the message the monarchy would now send. Funding structures were reviewed, legal counsel consulted, and communication strategies devised to ensure that both the public and private spheres were managed with precision. Every action was deliberate, every word calculated, yet no amount of planning could fully mitigate the emotional impact. Within this maelstrom, conflicting perspectives emerged. Some family members believed the action was necessary to preserve the integrity of the institution. Others questioned the timing, the tone, and the long-term repercussions. Private disagreements, though not publicized, created subtle tension in meetings, social engagements, and ceremonial functions. Even small decisions, who would attend a particular event, how a speech would be framed, what message would be delivered publicly, were now influenced by the shadow of the recent announcement. The press, as always, was quick to capitalize. Though the family had hoped to manage the fallout with discretion, reporters and commentators dissected every nuance. Headlines questioned motives, analyzed family dynamics, and speculated on future outcomes. International media coverage ensured that the narrative extended far beyond the United Kingdom, framing the decision in a global context and highlighting the human drama at its core. Amidst all this, there was one constant: the human cost. William had acted decisively, but that decisiveness came at an emotional toll that could not be ignored. Every private conversation, every interaction with his brother, carried the weight of history, duty, and familial bonds. Even as he maintained composure publicly, the private reality was a web of emotional complexity. The decision had created a fracture, one that might never fully heal, and every member of the royal family was now navigating that fracture in their own way. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan's allies outside the palace began mobilizing. Friends, advisors, and media contacts offered support, guidance, and strategies for navigating the unprecedented circumstances. While the palace focused on containment and perception, the couple faced the challenge of charting a path forward in a world that was now watching, judging, and analyzing every move. Directly asking the audience, how do you reconcile duty with love? How do you navigate loyalty when institutional obligations demand actions that hurt those you care about most? The royal family, in this moment, was living through this exact dilemma. Every choice, every word, every silence carried profound significance. Even as the immediate fallout unfolded, strategic considerations remained. The palace had to manage both internal and external perceptions. Public statements needed to be crafted, charitable organizations reassured, and protocols reinforced. Every detail mattered, and every move had consequences. The interplay between emotion and strategy created a tension that was both dramatic and historically significant. And yet, despite all preparation, the unpredictability of human emotion ensured that surprises would continue. Family members reacted in unexpected ways. Conversations, normally routine, carried subtext and hidden meaning. Private meetings became charged with historical weight, as the implications of William's decision reverberated through every layer of the institution. By evening, the palace was still alive with quiet, tense energy. The public, of course, was unaware of the private emotional landscape, the heartbreak, the shock, the subtle interpersonal shifts that had just occurred. But within the palace walls, every person knew that nothing would be the same again. The announcement had set into motion a series of events and reactions that could not be reversed. And amidst all this tension, one fact stood out. Harry and Meghan, though isolated from the privileges they once held, were still human beings with agency, emotion, and resilience. Their next moves, both personal and public, would define the ongoing narrative, and the family would have to respond, adapt, and contend with consequences that would unfold over months, if not years. But what happened in the days immediately following the announcement? The private confrontations, the whispered phone calls, the strategic decisions made in quiet corners of the palace would reveal layers of drama and betrayal that no one outside the inner circle could have predicted. No sooner had the announcement left the palace than the world erupted. Across the globe, screens flickered with headlines that screamed of shock, scandal, and heartbreak. Social media platforms became a battlefield, with millions weighing in, analyzing, and speculating. The official revocation of Harry and Meghan's royal privileges was no longer a private family matter. It had become a public spectacle of unprecedented scale. The immediacy of the reaction was staggering. Within minutes, journalists, commentators, and influencers were dissecting every angle. Tweets flew, memes were created, and video clips recirculated to capture what the public imagined to be the emotional moment of revelation. Headlines ranged from sympathetic, Harry and Meghan in tears after royal cut, to critical, monarchy draws the line. Sussex's independence ends here. The public debate split sharply, reflecting the global fascination with the couple and the monarchy alike. For supporters of Harry and Meghan, the announcement felt cruel, almost unbelievable. How can they strip two people of everything in one stroke? Asked one Twitter user. This is cold, calculated, and heartless, read another post, accompanied by images of the couple in happier times, smiles frozen in memory. Fans shared emotional reactions, expressing both grief for the couple and outrage at what they saw as institutional harshness. Critics, however, praised the move as decisive, necessary, and emblematic of William's commitment to tradition. The monarchy cannot tolerate ambiguity, wrote a prominent British commentator. Titles, funding, and patronages are privileges tied to duty. When boundaries are crossed, firm action is required. The dichotomy was striking. Sympathy and outrage on one side, approval and admiration on the other. Social media analytics later revealed millions of interactions within the first hour alone, a scale rarely seen for a royal event that was primarily internal. Television networks interrupted programming to cover the story. News anchors, their voices a mix of gravitas and incredulity, outlined the sequence of events, the decision-making process, and the likely consequences. Pundits debated not just the act itself, but the symbolism, the human impact, and the long-term implications for the monarchy. In homes across the world, viewers were transfixed, unable to look away from a drama that had all the elements of a historic scandal: family conflict, institutional authority, tears, and betrayal. The frenzy was amplified by speculation. Analysts questioned whether this move would permanently sever Harry and Meghan from royal duties, whether reconciliation was possible, and how the public would perceive William's decisive action. Headlines used words like shocking, unprecedented, and historic to describe the unfolding situation. Each article, each segment, each post fed into a cycle of curiosity, emotion, and engagement that few events in recent royal history had matched. And yet, amid the frenzy, nuances were lost. The emotional reality of the couple's response. Private heartbreak, whispered conversations, and intimate moments of reflection was invisible to the public eye. Fans projected their interpretations onto the situation, creating narratives that were often far removed from the truth of human experience. In this sense, the media frenzy became a second layer of reality, a parallel drama played out in headlines, tweets, and commentary. Memes, GIFs, and video clips began circulating almost instantly, capturing imagined emotional reactions. Some showed Harry and Meghan in exaggerated sadness. Others depicted William as a stern figure of authority. Humor, irony, and dramatization blended with serious commentary, creating a chaotic mix of entertainment and news. For some, the situation became fodder for political analogies, social debates, and even psychological analysis. The story had transcended its private origins, entering the cultural consciousness in ways that were immediate, global, and impossible to control. International media outlets seized on the story, contextualizing it for their audiences. In the United States, commentators framed the announcement as a battle between individual autonomy and institutional obligation, highlighting Harry and Meghan's efforts to forge independent paths. In Europe, coverage emphasized historical continuity and the challenges of balancing modern values with centuries-old traditions. Across continents, The story became a touchpoint for broader discussions about family, authority, and the public's fascination with royalty. The emotional spikes were everywhere. Supporters posted emotional tributes to the couple, emphasizing resilience and independence. Critics posted analytical breakdowns of William's decision, praising his leadership while questioning the human cost. Celebrities and public figures weighed in, some expressing empathy, others admiration, and a few outright criticism. Every interaction amplified the drama, feeding into a global narrative that moved faster than any single palace communication could manage. One particularly remarkable aspect of the reaction was the speed with which speculation became fact in the public imagination. Leaks, half-truths, and rumors proliferated, creating a landscape in which every narrative had to be considered both true and false simultaneously. Social media feeds overflowed with conjecture. Was reconciliation possible? Were there private messages exchanged that were not reported? Could titles and funding be restored under certain conditions? The palace's careful messaging could not keep up with the velocity of public imagination. Amid the frenzy, Harry and Meghan were forced to navigate not only their own emotional reactions, but also the public perception of those reactions. Every statement, every gesture, every carefully curated appearance was now subject to global scrutiny. How does one grieve privately while the world watches? How does one process betrayal when every emotion is analyzed, shared, and debated? These questions became part of the ongoing drama, adding layers of complexity to an already charged situation. Directly addressing the audience. Imagine the psychological pressure of knowing that the world is observing your most personal, vulnerable moments. How would you cope? Could you maintain composure, balance public expectations, and still process the shock, grief, and confusion that comes from a life-altering announcement? Harry and Meghan faced these challenges daily, and the intensity of global attention only magnified the emotional stakes. The palace, of course, was acutely aware of the media frenzy. Every communication, statement, and public appearance had to be carefully coordinated. Advisors worked around the clock to manage perceptions, protect the institution's integrity, and anticipate further questions. Every decision was scrutinized for potential missteps, every word for unintended connotations. In the midst of this, the private emotional reality, Harry and Meghan's tears, shock, and reflections, remained largely hidden from the world. Meanwhile, the media narrative continued to evolve. Headlines shifted from reporting facts to analyzing implications, political ramifications, cultural debates, and even psychological assessments. Some journalists focused on the couple's likely next steps, predicting media projects, relocation plans, or public statements. Others speculated on family dynamics, assessing potential reconciliation or predicting further conflict. The story, though rooted in a single announcement, had exploded into a multifaceted global discussion. And then came the unexpected twists. Social media influencers, international celebrities, and even former royal aides began weighing in with commentary that blurred the lines between analysis and speculation. Public opinion polls reflected wide divergence. Some audiences expressed overwhelming sympathy for the couple, others praised the decisive action of William, and yet others remained unsure, caught between conflicting narratives. The intensity of public engagement ensured that every subsequent development would be amplified, scrutinized, and debated. Even as the headlines continued, the palace realized that controlling the narrative was now a near impossible task. Global attention was relentless, unyielding, and omnipresent. Every word, gesture, and decision would be magnified, reinterpreted, and reframed in real time. The emotional stakes for Harry and Meghan were now inseparable from the media spectacle, creating a pressure cooker environment that few could endure without strain. And yet, amid the chaos, a central fact remained. Harry and Meghan were human beings experiencing real, raw emotion. While the world analyzed, speculated, and debated, their lives had been fundamentally altered in a single, irrevocable moment. The media frenzy, while compelling and dramatic, could not erase the tears, the heartbreak, and the deep sense of loss they felt privately. But what unfolded next? Harry and Meghan's immediate response, the private conversations that took place in quiet rooms, and the subtle, strategic moves they began planning, would escalate the drama to an entirely new level, one that the public had not yet imagined. The private wing of the palace was silent except for the soft rustle of papers and the faint, restrained sobs that had begun to echo through the room. For the first time in public memory, the couple, once seen as the confident, media-savvy Duke and Duchess of Sussex, were completely unguarded. Tears rolled freely, betraying a mix of shock, heartbreak, and a dawning understanding of the permanence of what had just happened. Imagine the scenario: a lifetime of privilege, influence, and identity, tied to centuries of history, reduced to a single, irrevocable decision. The letter William had delivered was not merely words on paper. It was a declaration that everything they had known and relied upon within the monarchy had been formally severed. Every title revoked, every patronage reassigned, every source of funding withdrawn. It was an absolute, uncompromising cut, and in that moment, the human weight of it hit with full force. Harry and Meghan had prepared themselves, or so they thought. They had imagined confrontations, difficult conversations, and even public scrutiny. But the reality of seeing their privileges formally rescinded, in writing, delivered by a brother who carried both love and duty, was something else entirely. The formal language of the document masked an emotional reality that could not be contained. For them, it was more than symbolic. It was deeply personal. Meghan sat at the edge of a polished chair, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the envelope in her hand, reading and rereading the contents as if a second look could somehow alter the verdict. Harry, standing nearby, paced the length of the room, his usual composure replaced by a restless agitation. The couple, known for their resilience in public, were now vulnerable, raw, and entirely human. The palace staff, discreetly observing, knew that this was a moment few outside these walls would ever witness. The private fallout of a decision that would dominate headlines for months, perhaps years. Tears were only part of the emotional spectrum. There was disbelief. Could this really be happening? There was grief. Everything we built is gone in an instant. There was anger. How could this happen without negotiation, without warning? And there was a cold, creeping realization. This is not temporary. This is permanent. Every tear, every breath, every whispered word carried the emotional weight of centuries of tradition colliding with the couple's personal aspirations. It was also a moment of reflection. Harry thought of his childhood, of family holidays, of shared memories with William and Charles. Every instance, every story, every moment of sibling camaraderie suddenly seemed juxtaposed against the stark reality of the present. Meghan, equally reflective, considered her own role, her responsibilities to her family, and the implications for their children. In that quiet, heavy room, history, duty, and personal identity collided in ways that were almost unbearable. The psychological strain was evident. Tears were not merely a response to loss. They were a manifestation of every pressure point the couple had faced over years of public scrutiny and private tension. They had weathered media attacks, internal family disagreements, and global judgment, but nothing had prepared them for the immediacy and absolute finality of William's decision. The emotional magnitude of being stripped of royal privileges in one fell swoop was almost unimaginable. And yet, amid the grief, there were flashes of clarity. Harry and Meghan understood that their lives would continue, albeit on a dramatically altered path. The tears, while immediate, were only the beginning of processing a complex reality. They had to reconcile the pain of loss with the necessity of planning for a future now unbound by royal expectations, but also deprived of the support and prestige that had previously defined their existence. The palace staff, acutely aware of the need for discretion, moved with care. Their presence was professional yet empathetic, providing silent support without intrusion. In many ways, this response underscored the human dimension of the monarchy. Behind every policy, every decree, every historical decision, there are people navigating emotion, loyalty, and compassion. Observers outside the palace could not see this moment, but the media and public would soon catch glimpses. Images of the couple, carefully curated over years, now had an added layer of meaning. Every smile, every posture, every engagement was retrospectively filtered through the knowledge that this private devastation had occurred. Fans and critics alike would interpret the fallout through their own lenses, often projecting assumptions, sympathies, or judgments that could never fully capture the reality of the emotional experience. The emotional weight also sparked a flurry of private communication. Friends, advisors, and allies reached out with messages of support, guidance, and reassurance. Phone calls were exchanged in hushed tones, offering practical advice, moral support, and even strategic counsel. The couple had to process not only the raw emotion but also the implications for public messaging, charitable obligations, and personal reputation. Every call, every message, every interaction was another layer in a complex web of emotion and consequence. Despite the heartbreak, the tears were not entirely despair. They carried with them a sense of resolve, a quiet, determined recognition that while privileges could be stripped away, the couple's agency, voice, and influence were not entirely lost. The tears marked the end of one chapter, but they also signaled the beginning of another. In private sorrow, there was a nascent clarity. They had to redefine themselves, their public narrative, and their personal legacy, independent of the structures they had been removed from. Yet, even as resilience began to emerge, the human cost was undeniable. The immediate grief was compounded by uncertainty. How would the rest of the family respond? What would the public think? Would reconciliation ever be possible? Could trust be rebuilt? Or had a permanent fracture been created? Each question carried its own emotional spike, layering complexity onto an already charged situation. Even their children, though shielded from the immediate reality, were indirectly affected. Every parent contemplates the emotional and practical consequences of decisions on their offspring. But in this case, the stakes were magnified by the public eye, the historic institution, and the permanence of the official revocation. The responsibility of guiding and protecting their children while processing personal heartbreak added yet another layer of emotional intensity. Directly addressing the audience, can you imagine a moment in your life where everything familiar, everything that had defined your identity, was suddenly stripped away? How would you react? Could you process shock, grief, anger, and determination simultaneously, all under global scrutiny? Harry and Meghan were living that reality in real time, with no opportunity to pause, no place to retreat from the scrutiny, and no guarantee of public understanding or sympathy. And yet, despite the tears, the emotional storm, and the global attention, they began to plan. Every reaction, every gesture, every choice moving forward would be calculated with precision. Private discussions about public statements, strategies for maintaining influence, and plans for personal, familial, and professional continuity. In other words, even in grief, action was necessary, a hallmark of the resilience that had defined the couple throughout their public and private lives. But even as they processed the immediate reality, one undeniable fact loomed. This was only the beginning. The public reaction, the family response, and the next series of strategic moves would escalate the drama far beyond these private tears.